All right, guys, here we go. So where we left off, he had made his larger bow and arrow. He got the arrows to work, and he practiced. And he said he was going to hunt big. He's trying to get a deer. So let's see what happens. He didn't know the time, but somewhere in the middle of the night, he awakened suddenly. He had come to rely on his senses, but he knew something had changed to snap him awake the way that, and he laid his eyes wide in the dark, listening, smelling, trying to see. He did not have long to wait. There was a soft rustle, then a woofing sound, and the whole wall of the shelter peeled away from the rock as if caught in an earthquake, away and down, and Brian, still in his bag, was looking up in the dark at the enormous form of a bear leaning over him. There was no time to react, to move, to do anything. Meat. Brian had time to think. He smelled the venison and come for it. He's come for the meat, and it was true. The bear had come for the meat, but the problem was that Brian lay between the bear and the meat, and the bear cuffed him to the side. As it wasn't much of a cuff, nowhere near what the bear could have done, which would have broken Brian's legs. But the bag was zipped, and Brian became tangled in it and couldn't move fast enough to stay out of the way, so the bear hit him again. This time hard. The blow took Brian in the upper thighs, and even though the bag was solid enough to nearly dislocate his hip, he cried out, "Ah!" The bear stopped dead in the darkness. Brian could see the head turn to look back and down at him. A slow turning, huge and full of threat. And the bear's breath washed over him, and he thought, "I am going to die now. All this that I have done, and I'm going to die because a bear wants to eat, and I am in the way." He could see the bear's teeth, and it showed them, and he simply couldn't do anything, couldn't move, couldn't react. It was over. The bear started to move down toward Brian and then hesitated, stopped and raised its head again and turned to look back over its shoulder to the left. Half a beat and Brian lay still, staring up at the bear. But now a new smell over the smell of the bear, a rank, foul, sulphurous, and gagging smell as the bear turned and took a full shot of skunk spray directly in the eyes. Betty had arrived. Whether she'd just been out hunting and had come back, or had been awakened and surprised, or simply didn't like bears very much, whatever the reason, she had dumped a full load in the bear's face. The effect was immediate and devastating. Rawr! The bear seemed to turn inside itself, knocking Brian farther to the side, and rolled backward out of the shelter area, slamming its head back and forth on the ground, trying to clear its eyes, hacking and throwing up as it vanished in the night. Brian looked to the source of all of this. Betty stood near the end of the shelter, still with her tail raised, only now aimed at Brian. She twitched it once, then again, and Brian shook his head. "I'm sorry, I just didn't think you'd be thinking of food." He took a piece of meat from the pile, a big one, and tossed it to her, and she lowered her tail, picked up the meat, and waddled off into the darkness in the direction of her burrow. Brian lay back in his bag. His shelter was a mess. The wall tipped over, and his hip hurt. But it wasn't raining, and the bag was warm. He could fix things up in the morning. The stink of skunk was everywhere. Much of what Betty had shot at the bear had gone around it and hit the wall. But Brian didn't mind. In fact, he thought, "I've grown kind of fond of it. I'll have to make sure to give her extra food." It was like having a pet nuclear device. He went to sleep smiling. In the morning, he found that the damage was not as extreme as he'd thought. The bear had tipped the wall away and down, but the dried mud had held it together, and Brian, after 4 heaving tries, tipped it back up and against the rock. He chopped a hole in the thin ice near the edge of the lake and brought up new mud to pack in around the seam, and inside an hour it was as good as new. Then he reviewed his thinking. The war bow wouldn't help, at least not as a protected device. He'd shot it and it made it work for him, but in the dark. In the night in the shelter, there was no way he could have gotten the bow aligned or an arrow into the bear. And God knew what would have happened if he had hit the bear with the arrow, especially if he'd missed anything vital. The bear would have been really mad then. Even Betty wouldn't have been able to stop the thing. Perhaps he thought a lance, a killing lance, if he used the same principle as with the arrows. He went back to the stone he'd been chipping arrowheads from and studied it. He would need a wider, longer head, and the flakes came off too small for a spear. Near it there were other black stones, however, and he tapped at them with the back of the hatchet, knocking off flakes until he hit one that had a bigger pattern. 3 times he hit and took off the flakes that were irregular or that broke in the middle, but on the 4th try he came away with a piece almost as wide as his palm and about 7 inches long, tapering to a sharp point and with 2 edges like razors. He worked tiny notches into the round end and mounted the point in one of his hardwood spears, carefully splitting the wood back, and then tying the head in place with a thin strip of deer hide, which proved to be much tougher than the rabbit skin, and burning the hair off when he was done. He hefted the lance and held it out, bracing with his arm. It wouldn't do any good to throw, but for in close, like last night, if he had to use it, the head should cause some damage, or at least discourage a bear. He nodded. Good. If nothing else, it gave him a feeling of security. Later on, he would think on how strange things were. He would never see the bear again inside the shelter and would never be threatened again. Yet, the lance would save his life. Any predictions on what the lance is going to save him from if it's not going to be a bear? All right, answer that one. And I'm also going to keep reading. I'm going to start part 2, winter, just because chapter 7 was so short. So here we go, chapter 8. He awakened when he had slept enough and looked out of the shelter by cracking the door. It was cold and low and gray and raining, a dismal rain much like the one that had lasted so long earlier in the fall. And he kindled the fire with dry wood he'd set aside the night before when he'd seen the clouds moving in. Soon the inside of the shelter was cheery and warm, the smoke working its way out of the hole at the top, and he wished he'd thought to bring water in the night before, and he also wished he didn't have to do what he had to do now. But he couldn't fight it, and at last he pulled himself out of the bag, grabbed the hatchet and the largest aluminum pot, and plunged out into the rain. As fast as possible, standing barefoot on the freezing wet ground, he went to the bathroom and then ran to the lake and chopped his watering hole open. It had frozen thinly overnight, and he filled the pan and ran back to the shelter. He slid the door back in place and put the pot on the fire and dropped a piece of venison into it to make a breakfast stew. The meat was getting low. He had stretched the wolf-killed doe as far as he could, trying to ration it and eat smaller amounts. But he'd have to hunt within 4 or 5 days. He put a piece of meat outside the door for Betty, surprised that she wasn't there already, and leaned back to think. In the past few days it had become colder. The weather had kind of steady feel to it, as if it was not going to get warmer, but would stay cold, and he had to face some truths. He simply wasn't ready for cold weather. Oh, he thought, the shelter was all right, and the woods were full of fuel. But his clothing was pitiful. His jeans were holding together just, but his tennis shoes were about gone. His socks long since used to shreds, and on top all he had was a t-shirt, also nearly in pieces, and the rabbit skin vest. I am, he thought, a mess. He was tempted to smile, except that it wasn't really funny. He could sit in the shelter and stay warm, but unless he could hunt, he would die, and he couldn't hunt unless he had something to wear to keep from freezing. To death, he thought, the truth sliding in like a snake. I could freeze to death. Not quite yet. It wasn't that cold yet, but soon. He didn't know northern winters, but he knew it would get cold enough to kill him and freeze him solid. He took stock again. No clothing, although he still had some rabbit hides, which he could sew into sleeves for his vest. There was also the hide from the doe. He looked at it and thought he might get a pair of moccasins out of it. They would be crude, but if he stitched them with the hair on the inside and made them big enough to wear over his tattered tennis shoes, they would help. He set to work on what he could do and spent all of that day sewing the rest of the rabbit skins into 2 tubes, which he attached as sleeves to the vest. When he tried it on, everything crackled as if he were wearing paper, but it seemed to hold together, and he slept that night feeling slightly better about his future. The next morning he checked the weather, still raining and colder than it had been the previous morning, and then set to work making footgear. It proved both easier and harder than he thought it would be. The easy part was making a pattern. He just stood on the dry skin and marked around his foot with a piece of charcoal from the fire pit. When he'd cut out the 2 bottoms, he cut 2 rectangles from the remaining hide and stitched, with some effort as the hide was thick and tough, the 2 pieces into rough cylinders. Then he sewed each of the tubes down to the sole, attaching it all around the edge, and when he was done he had 2 clunky boots that he could stick his tennis shoes down into. With the hair on the inside, they felt warm the minute he stuck his feet into them. He used the last bits of hide to cut 2 strips to use for lacing, to pull the tops of the cylinders tight to his legs. They hit about mid-calf, and it was here he learned how to soften leather. The deer hide was dried, and working with it was about like working with thin wood. It had no give and was brittle and hard and very, very tough. It was all he could do to sew the cylinders to the bottom using thin-cut hide for lacing and punching holes with the tip of the knife. But the 2 straps that went around the top had to be soft enough to tie off. He thought of using the fishing line for thread, but didn't want to waste it. Then he found that by working the leather, first between his fingers and then by pulling it over a piece of wood that stuck out of the wall, he could soften it. It never got truly soft and supple like tanned deer hide, but it was workable and got the job done. He gathered more wood just before dark and went to sleep that night, dreaming of punching holes in leather with the tip of the knife. The image burned into his mind from sitting all day sewing. Sometime that night, near the middle, it grew quiet and the change awakened him. He listened for a time and realized that the rain had stopped, and he snuggled back in the bag, thinking that with no rain the next day he would hunt. In the morning he awakened and knew instantly that something had changed. Something about the sound. No, the lack of it. There was no sound. Normally he could hear birds in the morning or the wind rustling. Now there was nothing. He crawled out of the bed and opened the door of the shelter, or tried to. It seemed to be stuck, frozen in place. He pushed harder and finally half stood, crouched, and pushed out with his shoulder against the door. Anybody ideas? At first it still didn't move, and only when he crouched back and slammed into it with his shoulder did the door fall away, letting him look outside. It nearly blinded him. The entire world was white, bright white, with new morning sun glaring off and through it, and so intense that it made his temples hurt. Snow had fallen in the night. Soft, large flakes, nearly 4 inches deep everywhere. On limbs, logs, the grounds, on the lake ice, all over, and even 4 inches. And it was cold. Colder than it had been so far. His nostril hairs seemed to stick together when he breathed, and the air caught in his throat. The world was so incredibly, wonderfully, stunningly beautiful that for a full minute all he could do was stare. Oh. He had seen pictures of the woods with snow, and had seen snow in the park and in the city, but this was different. He was in it, inside the snowy scene, and the beauty of it became part of him. He stepped outside the shelter, and as he stepped into the snow, realized that he was barefoot. He jumped back inside and put on his tennis shoes and fur boots and the rabbit-skin shirt and moved back outside. He had never seen anything so clean. Because it was all new, there wasn't a mark, not a track in the surface of the snow, and he took 4 or 5 paces just to look back at his tracks. "It's like a Bigfoot," he said aloud, and indeed the boots left a large, rounded hole for a footprint. He moved around, did his toilet, drawing a picture in the snow when he did, and was amazed how well the boots worked, kept his feet warm and comfortable. As he came close to the shelter, he saw a mouse appear almost magically out of the snow, run across the surface for 3 feet, and then dive under again. Brian moved to where the mouse had run and studied its tracks. Little dots in a parallel line with a small line in the middle where the tail dragged. But clean, he thought, and neat, and so easy to see and follow, and everything that moved in the woods would leave tracks, would be easy to see, would be easy to follow, would be much easier to hunt. He still had some venison left, but he decided to hunt, because the snow was new and he never hunted in snow, because the sun was bright and fresh, because his clothing seemed to work. He decided to hunt, and it was in this way that he found the moose. All right, guys, do you think this is going to be maybe the same moose that attacked him and pushed him down into the lake and almost killed him in Hatchet? And is the moose going to remember him? And is he going to be able to take down the moose either with the new lance he made or with his new, stronger bow and arrow? What do you think?